Stop acting like a victim. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. My daughter-in-law leaned in just enough for only me to hear it, her perfume sharp, unfamiliar, completely out of place in a room that still smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that didn't belong at a funeral, just like her words. I didn't respond. I didn't look at her. I simply kept my eyes on the casket at the front of the room, the dark oak one I had chosen myself just 3 days ago, running my fingers over its smooth surface as if somehow, absurdly, I could still take care of him one last time. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels, because what happened next still doesn't feel real, even to me. The chapel felt colder than it should have. It was early March in Connecticut, the kind of day where winter hadn't quite let go yet. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, pressing down on everything. Inside, the air was still, heavy with quiet murmurs and restrained grief. My husband, Harold, had been gone for exactly 6 days. 6 days since the heart attack that took him in our kitchen, right between the coffee maker and the window where he used to stand every morning, watching the neighbors walk their dogs. One moment he was telling me we were out of sugar, and the next he was on the floor. 42 years of marriage, gone in less than a minute. I sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way Harold used to tease me about during church services. "You sit like you're being graded," he would whisper, smiling. I wondered if he would recognize me now, not just because of the black dress or the way my shoulders seemed to carry more weight than they used to, but because of the silence, the kind of silence that comes when something inside you shifts, not breaks, not shatters, but rearranges itself into something colder. Beside me sat my son, Daniel, 40 years old, my only child. He hadn't looked at me once since we arrived. His hands were clasped tightly together, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere on the carpet, as if the pattern there was more important than anything else in the room. He looked tired, worn down, but not from grief. No, there was something else in his expression, something distant, something decided. On his other side sat her, Vanessa. Perfect posture, perfect makeup, not a tear out of place. She wore black, of course, but it wasn't the kind of black you wear to mourn. It was tailored, structured, intentional, the kind of outfit that said she had thought very carefully about how she would be seen today. Even now, after what she whispered to me, she sat back in her seat as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just told a 71-year-old widow 6 days after burying her husband to stop acting like a victim. A quiet cough pulled me back to the present. The service was ending. People began to stand, one row at a time, moving slowly toward the front of the chapel to pay their respects. I rose with them, my knees stiff, my body heavier than it should have been. Daniel stood too. For a brief moment, just a second, I thought he might turn to me, say something, anything. But he didn't. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly at Vanessa, and followed the line forward. I walked behind them. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the casket and placed my hand gently on the wood. "I'm still here," I whispered. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Behind me, I could hear voices, low, polite, rehearsed condolences. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a wonderful man. If there's anything you need—" Empty words, not unkind, just empty. When I turned around, Vanessa was watching me, not with sympathy, not even with impatience, but with something colder. Assessment, as if she were measuring how long this would take, how much longer she would have to wait. For what, I didn't know yet, but I would. Oh, I would. The reception was held in the fellowship hall next door. Round tables, white top-cloths, coffee that tasted too weak, sandwiches no one really ate. I moved through it all like a guest at someone else's event, nodding when spoken to, offering small, polite smiles when required. My feet carried me from one conversation to another, but my mind stayed somewhere else entirely. At one point, an old neighbor, Margaret, I think, touched my arm gently. "You must come by sometime. You shouldn't be alone right now." I almost laughed. Alone. That word didn't mean what it used to. Because standing just across the room, laughing softly with a small group of people, was my son, and beside him, as always, was Vanessa. He looked lighter, relieved almost, and for the first time since Harold died, a thought slipped into my mind, quiet, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Was I the only one mourning him? I turned away before I could answer that question, and that's when I heard it again. "Honestly," Vanessa said, not bothering to lower her voice this time, "she's going to have to pull herself together eventually. This can't go on forever." Someone murmured something in response. I couldn't hear what, but I didn't need to, because in that moment, standing in a room full of people who had come to say goodbye to my husband, I realized something far more unsettling than grief. I wasn't just losing Harold, I was losing my place in this family. And judging by the way Vanessa looked at me, cool, patient, already planning, I had a feeling they weren't waiting for me to heal. They were waiting for me to leave.
The drive home was silent. The heater in Daniel's SUV hummed a low, mechanical tune that filled the space between us. I stared out the passenger window at the passing trees, skeletal and bare, reaching up into the gray Connecticut sky like desperate hands. My house, our house, appeared at the end of the driveway, a large white colonial that Harold and I had spent 30 years turning into a home. It looked the same from the outside, the same peeling paint on the porch railing we'd promised to fix this summer, the same wind chimes Harold had bought for our anniversary, clinking softly in the cold breeze. But as I stepped through the front door, it felt different. The air was stagnant. It smelled like dust and forgotten coffee. It was the smell of a machine that had stopped working. "I'll help you with your coat, Mom," Daniel said, his voice flat. He didn't wait for me to answer. He reached out, his fingers brushing my shoulder for a split second before pulling the heavy wool away. He didn't look at me. He looked at the coat rack. Vanessa walked past us without a word, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, a sound that felt like an intrusion in a house that still belonged to a dead man. She went straight to the kitchen, the cabinets already banging shut under her touch. "We should talk about the arrangements for the next few days," Vanessa called out, her voice echoing into the hallway. I walked into the living room and sat in my usual chair, the velvet one near the fireplace. It was still warm, or maybe that was just my imagination. Daniel stood in the doorway, checking his watch. "Vanessa thinks it's better if we stay here for a while, to help you settle. You shouldn't be alone." "I've been alone for 42 years whenever your father was on business trips, Daniel," I said softly. He didn't flinch, he didn't smile, he just nodded, as if I were a difficult client he was managing. "It's different now. You're fragile." Fragile, that was the word they used for people they wanted to break. I watched them from my chair. They didn't act like family members in mourning, they acted like surveyors. Vanessa was already moving a vase Harold had brought back from Japan, a delicate porcelain piece, moving it to the back of the shelf to make room for her laptop. Daniel was leafing through the mail on the sideboard, his eyes scanning the envelopes with a hunger he couldn't quite hide. They were talking in low tones, their heads bent together. Sometimes their eyes would dart towards me, then quickly away. The house was still the same, the photos of us were still on the walls, but the soul of it was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating energy that didn't belong here. I closed my eyes. I could still hear Vanessa's whisper from the funeral, "Stop acting like a victim." In this house, surrounded by the echoes of my life with Harold, I realized she wasn't just insulting my grief, she was issuing a warning. They weren't here to comfort me, they were here to occupy. And as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor, I realized that my own son was no longer a guest in my home. He was a landlord in waiting. 3 days after the funeral, the first boxes appeared. They weren't for me. I found Vanessa in the study, Harold's room, the place where he kept his books, his old fountain pens, and the stacks of records he'd collected since the 70s. She had a cardboard box on the desk, and she was currently wrapping his favorite brass paperweight with bubble wrap. "What are you doing, Vanessa?" I asked. My voice was steady, but my heart was beating a rhythm I didn't recognize. She didn't stop. "This room is a mess, Evelyn. It's full of things. We need to clear some space. Daniel needs a proper home office while we're staying here." "He has an office at his house," I said.
Well, we're going to be here more often now, she replied, finally looking at me. Her eyes were bright, hard. We need to modernize. This house is stuck in 1985. It's for your own good. Less clutter means less to worry about. I looked at the desk. The space where Harold's laptop used to sit was already occupied by a sleek silver monitor. His pens were gone. His leather-bound journal, the one he'd been writing in since our first grand tour of Europe, was nowhere to be seen. Where are his things? I asked. In the garage, she said, turning back to the shelf. In the donate pile. Most of it is just old paper anyway. That evening, Daniel avoided me even more than usual. When I asked him about the study, he didn't look up from his phone. Mom, you know Vanessa. She likes things organized. This house is too big for you to manage alone. We're just trying to take some of the load off. I didn't ask for the load to be moved, I said. He finally looked at me, but it wasn't the look of a son, it was the look of a doctor talking to a patient who didn't understand their own diagnosis. You're tired, Mom. Let us handle it. But then I saw the papers. They were sitting on the dining table, partially covered by a placemat. Legal documents. I caught the words power of attorney and property valuation before Daniel noticed me and quickly gathered them up. Just some insurance stuff, he muttered, his face reddening slightly. I went to my bedroom and locked the door. For the first time, I felt like a prisoner in my own home. I looked at the bedside table. My jewelry box was there, but when I opened it, my engagement ring, the one Harold had saved for 3 years to buy, was missing. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the locked door. They were faster than I thought. They weren't just taking over the house, they were erasing him, and in doing so, they were erasing me. They thought I was a victim because I was quiet, because I was old, because I stayed in my room while they rearranged my life. They didn't realize that in the silence, I wasn't just grieving, I was listening, and I was starting to understand exactly what kind of game they were playing. Tonight, the wind was howling against the window panes, a restless, angry sound that matched the storm brewing inside me. I found myself standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., the linoleum cold against my bare feet. I reached for the sugar jar, the one Harold had mentioned just before he collapsed. It was empty, just like he said. I leaned against the counter, and for a moment, I could almost feel him there. Harold was a man who didn't say much, but his presence was a shield. He was the one who handled the taxes, the one who made sure the roof was inspected, the one who always said, "Don't worry, Evelyn, I've handled it." He used to tell me, "Everything here is yours. Even when I'm gone, I've made sure of that." I remembered when we bought this house, we were 30 years younger, full of hope and the smell of fresh paint. We'd walked through these rooms when they were just empty shells, imagining our son growing up here. Our legacy, Harold had called it, but the legacy was currently sleeping in the guest room, probably dreaming of property values. I moved to the hallway and looked at the thermostat. It was set to 64 degrees. Harold always kept it at 70 because he knew my hands got cold. Vanessa had changed it because she said it was more efficient. Efficiency was their new god. I walked past the dining room, where the table was still covered in the shadows of the blueprints I'd seen earlier. Daniel was my only child. I'd spent 40 years loving him, protecting him, making sure he had the best of everything. I'd thought we were close, but looking at the way he looked at Vanessa, the way she let her dismantle his father's life, I realized I didn't know him at all. Was he always this weak? Or was I just too blinded by a mother's love to see the cracks? Harold would have known. He always had a better eye for character than I did. In my mind, I heard his voice again. "Everything here is yours." He said it so many times it became a mantra. He'd spent his whole life building a fortress for me. And now, the barbarians weren't at the gate. They were in the kitchen drinking my coffee and planning my retirement. I realized then that they were banking on my grief to keep me blind. They expected me to be the weeping widow, too heartbroken to notice the locks being changed or the bank accounts being shifted. They saw my silence as surrender, They thought Harold's death had left me defenseless, but as I stood in the dark, shivering in the 64-degree air, I realized Harold hadn't just left me a house and some money, he'd left me the strength he'd spent 42 years teaching me. I went back to my room, but I didn't go to sleep. I sat at my small writing desk and took out a clean sheet of paper. If they wanted a victim, they had come to the wrong house. It happened on a Tuesday. The house was quiet, or so they thought. Daniel and Vanessa were in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, the fire Harold used to build every evening. I was at the top of the stairs, hidden by the shadows of the landing. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the old vents like a poison. "The appraisal came in higher than expected," Vanessa said. Her voice was sharp, excited. "If we sell by May, we can clear enough to pay off the condo and put the down payment on the Hamptons place." "And Mom?" Daniel's voice was lower, hesitant. "She's not going to like it, Vanessa. She's lived here since before I was born." "She's not living here, Daniel. She's haunting the place," Vanessa snapped. "Look at her. She barely speaks. She sits in that chair like a statue. It's too much house for her. She'll be much happier at the Willows. They have a full social calendar and 24-hour care." "The Willows?" Daniel sounded surprised. That's a nursing home, Vanessa. It's an hour away." "It's a senior living community," she corrected him, "and it's the best thing for everyone. We can't spend every weekend here playing nursemaid. We have a life. Besides, the paperwork is almost ready. Once she signs the power of attorney, we can handle the listing ourselves. We don't even have to tell her until the movers are booked. It'll be less stressful for her that way." I felt a coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips. It wasn't a shock, not really. I'd felt the foundation shifting for days, but hearing it out loud, hearing my own son contemplate putting me in a cage so he could buy a vacation home, felt like a physical blow. "She's going to notice things are missing soon," Daniel said. "I've already moved the high-value items to the storage unit, the jewelry, the silver, the art. If she asks, tell her they're being cleaned or appraised for insurance. She's a victim of her own grief," Vanessa replied smoothly. "She won't argue. She doesn't have the energy." I backed away from the stairs, my steps silent on the carpet. I went into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. My breathing was shallow, my heart racing. A victim of her own grief. That's what they saw. A frail, broken woman who couldn't even see the knife they were holding to her throat. They had it all planned. The sale, the nursing home, the erasure of everything I had built with Harold. They were already spending the money from my husband's life. But they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed that because I was silent, I was empty. They didn't know about the small black safe hidden behind the loose panel in Harold's closet, the one Harold had told me about years before the heart attack. "In case of emergency," he had said, "in case the world decides to test you." I looked at the closet door. The test had arrived, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It was fury. The doorbell rang at noon the next day. Vanessa answered it, her charming hostess voice echoing through the hall, but it was quickly replaced by a confused silence. I walked down the stairs to find a man standing on the porch. He was tall, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, and holding a briefcase that looked like it had seen a lot of courtrooms. "Can I help you?" Vanessa asked, her tone already guarded. The man didn't look at her. He looked past her, straight at me. "Evelyn," he said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Harold was a dear friend." It was Arthur, Harold's lawyer, but more than that, his roommate from college. I hadn't seen him in years, but his voice was as familiar as a warm blanket. "Arthur," I said, stepping forward, "thank you for coming." Vanessa stepped between us. "I'm sorry, Mr. Arthur Vance," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "I'm Harold's estate attorney and the executor of his will." Vanessa's eyes widened. She turned to me, her fake smile slipping. "Evelyn, why didn't you tell us you'd called a lawyer? We were going to handle all of this for you." "I didn't call him," I said, calmly. "Harold did.
Years ago. Arthur walked into the living room, ignoring Vanessa's protests. He sat down and opened his briefcase. Harold was a very thorough man, Evelyn. He knew how things could get complicated. He left a set of instructions that were to be triggered exactly 7 days after his funeral. Daniel walked in then, his face pale. "Arthur, what's going on?" "Daniel," Arthur nodded. "Good to see you. I was just explaining to your wife that your father left a very specific legacy." Arthur pulled out a thick document. "Most people think the house and the accounts are simple joint property, but Harold was concerned about outside influences. He placed this house into a private trust 10 years ago." Vanessa leaned forward, her voice tight. "A trust? We're the heirs, Arthur. Daniel is his only son." "Yes," Arthur said, his eyes hard as flint, "but the trust has a primary beneficiary and a very specific clause regarding its dissolution." He looked at me, and for the first time since Harold died, I felt a spark of hope. "The house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the explicit written consent of Evelyn, and should anyone attempt to coerce her or remove her from the property against her will, the entire estate, including all cash assets, is diverted to a charitable foundation." The silence in the room was deafening. Vanessa looked like she'd been slapped. Daniel looked at the floor. "Wait," Vanessa hissed. "That's not possible. We were working on the power of attorney." "Unless it's signed, it's just paper, Mrs. Miller," Arthur said, standing up. He handed me a small leather-bound folder. "And Harold left a personal letter for you, Evelyn. I think you should read it." He walked to the door, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. The security cameras Harold had installed last year, the ones he told you were for the perimeter, they have audio, Daniel, and they upload directly to my firm's server." He tipped his hat and walked out. I looked at my son and his wife. They were standing in the wreckage of their plan, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who was afraid. For the next 2 days, the house was a tomb. Vanessa didn't speak. She spent her time in the guest room. The door slammed shut. Daniel hovered in the hallways like a ghost, his face a mask of shame and frustration. I, however, felt a strange, cold clarity. I didn't confront them. I didn't yell. I didn't even mention the trust. Instead, I went about my day with a precision that seemed to unnerve them. I made myself coffee. I sat in my chair. I even began to put Harold's things back where they belonged. I walked into the study and took the silver monitor off the desk. I carried it to the hallway and set it on the floor. Then I went to the garage, found the box labeled Donate, and brought Harold's journals back inside. I worked slowly, deliberately. When Daniel saw me carrying the boxes, he tried to help. "Mom, let me—" "No, Daniel," I said, not looking at him. "I've got it. I wouldn't want to be a burden." He winced. I spend my evenings reading Harold's letter. It wasn't full of romantic fluff. It was a manual. He'd seen Vanessa coming from a mile away. He'd seen Daniel's weakness. "Evelyn," he wrote, "they will think you are a victim because you are kind. They will think you are weak because you are quiet. Let them think it. Let them show their hand. And when they do, remember that you are the one who holds all the cards. This house is your fortress. Don't let them take a single brick." I watched them from the kitchen window. They were outside, pacing the lawn, arguing in hushed tones. I knew what they were doing. They were looking for a loophole. They were trying to find a way to break the trust. They didn't realize that Arthur wasn't just a lawyer. He was a shark, and he'd built a cage that no one could escape from. But I wasn't done. Simply keeping the house wasn't enough, not after what they'd said, not after the way they'd treated Harold's memory. I picked up the phone and made a call, not to Arthur, to the storage facility Vanessa had mentioned. "Yes," I said into the receiver, my voice as cold as the Connecticut winter. "I'd like to report a set of stolen items, my jewelry, my silver. Yes, I have the descriptions, and I have the names of the people who took them." I hung up and looked at the clock. The game was entering the final stage. and for the first time, I was the one setting the rules.
The confrontation happened at dinner. Vanessa had finally come out of her room, her face tight with a desperate, manic kind of energy. She had a stack of papers in her hand. "Evelyn," she started, sitting across from me, "we need to be reasonable. This trust, it's a mistake. Harold wasn't in his right mind when he wrote it. He was paranoid, and it's holding you back. You can't afford the taxes on this place. You don't have the income." "I have Harold's life insurance, Vanessa," I said calmly, "and his pension." "It's not enough," she snapped. "You're being stubborn. You're acting like a victim of your own pride. You're going to end up in debt, and then we won't be able to help you. We're offering you a way out, a beautiful life at the Willows." She pushed a brochure across the table. It showed a smiling woman in a wheelchair looking at a garden. "You have until Monday to decide," she said. "If you don't sign the release for the trust, we're going to have to take legal action. Daniel will have to testify that you're incompetent, that you're unable to manage your own affairs." I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a crumb on the tablecloth. "Is that true, Daniel? Are you going to tell a judge that your mother is insane because she wants to stay in her own home?" "Mom, it's just for your safety," he whispered. "You're a burden to yourself here. You're always so lost." "A burden." I repeated the word. It felt heavy, like a stone. "Yes," Vanessa hissed. "A burden. We have kids, Evelyn. We have a future. We can't be tied to this old house and your constant grieving. You told us to move on, didn't you? Well, we are moving on, with or without you." She stood up, her eyes flashing with a cruel triumph. "Monday morning, sign the papers or we start the competency hearing, and trust me, Evelyn, you won't win." They walked out of the room, leaving the brochure on the table. I looked at the picture of the woman in the wheelchair. A burden. They had said it, finally. The truth was out in the open, raw and ugly. I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, not for myself, but for the boy I had raised. The boy who had once given me macaroni necklaces and promised to take care of me forever. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who had sold his soul for a condo and a wife's approval. But the sadness didn't last. I picked up the brochure and walked to the fireplace. I tossed it onto the embers and watched it curl into black ash. They thought they had given me an ultimatum. They didn't realize they had just given me permission. I walked to the phone and dialed Arthur's private number. "Arthur," I said, "it's time. Trigger the claws, all of them." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in deception. I played the part perfectly. I stayed in my room. I let my voice tremble when I spoke. I even left a few tissue boxes around to make it look like I hadn't stopped crying. Vanessa was ecstatic. She spent the weekend on the phone with real estate agents, her voice booming through the house. "Yes, 5 bedrooms, original hardwood. We're looking for a quick close." Daniel was more quiet, but I could see him checking his bank account on his laptop every hour. They were already counting the money. But while they were planning their future, I was securing mine. Arthur arrived on Sunday night while they were out at a celebratory dinner. He didn't come to the front door. He came through the garden gate. "Everything is ready, Evelyn." He handed me a small USB drive. "The police have the report on the stolen property. The trust has been locked, and I've notified the bank about the suspicious activity on the joint account." "And the recording?" I asked. "Crystal clear," Arthur said with a small, grim smile. "Their conversation about the nursing home, the cells, and the burden comment, it's all there. It's more than enough for a restraining order, let alone a competency hearing." I looked at the USB drive. It felt light in my hand, but I knew it was the weight that would crush them. "I want them out tomorrow," I said. "They'll be out," Arthur promised. "And Harold, he would be proud of you." I didn't feel proud. I felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind you feel after you've finally cleaned out a basement full of junk. I spent the night in Harold's study. I sat at his desk and I realized that for the first time in weeks, I wasn't waiting for him to come back. I was moves ahead of the people who thought I was behind. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear light. The Connecticut sky was blue for the first time in weeks. I heard Daniel and Vanessa downstairs. I heard the coffee maker. I heard the sound of their laughter. They thought this was the day they won. They thought this was the day I surrendered. I took a deep breath, adjusted my shawl, and walked down the stairs.
They were waiting for me in the dining room. Vanessa had a pen ready. "Good morning, Evelyn. You look better today. Rested." "I am," I said. I sat at the head of the table, Harold's seat. Daniel looked at me, a flicker of something like guilt in his eyes. "Mom, we can go over the papers one last time if you want. It's really for the best." "I'm sure it is," I said. I looked at the documents, the power of attorney, the trust dissolution, the Willow's admission form. I reached out and picked up the pen. Vanessa leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive coffee and victory. But instead of signing, I looked up. "Vanessa, do you remember what you whispered to me at the funeral?" She stiffened. Her eyes darted to Daniel, then back to me. "Evelyn, let's not get emotional. We're here for business." "You told me to stop acting like a victim," I said. My voice was calm, conversational. "You said I needed to pull myself together. You said I was a burden." "Mom, please," Daniel started. "I listened to you," I continued, ignoring him. "I realized you were right. I was acting like a victim. I was letting you walk through my house and take my husband's things. I was letting you plan my life as if I were a child." I set the pen down. "So I stopped." Vanessa laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "And what does that mean? You're going to fight us? With what? You have nothing, Evelyn. We've already started the paperwork for the hearing." "Actually," I said, "you're the ones with the paperwork problem." The front door opened. 2 men in suits walked in. Not Arthur, but men with badges, and behind them, Arthur himself. "Daniel Miller, Vanessa Miller?" one of the officers asked. "We're here regarding a report of stolen property. Several items of high-value jewelry and silver were reported missing from this address. We've recovered them from a storage unit registered in your name, Mrs. Miller." Vanessa went white. That's family property. We were just—" "And," Arthur stepped forward, "I have a court-ordered eviction notice. Under the terms of the Miller Family Trust, any attempt to coerce or mistreat the primary beneficiary resulting in legal action triggers an immediate removal of all guests from the property." Daniel stood up, his chair clattering to the floor. "Mom, what is this?" "This is me not being a victim, Daniel," I said. I stood up and looked at them, really looked at them. They looked small. They looked like the greedy, hollow people they were. "You have 1 hour to pack your bags. The police will wait. And your accounts, the ones Harold set up for you, they've been frozen pending the investigation into the theft." Vanessa started to scream. She called me a senile old woman. She called me a monster. I didn't even flinch. I just looked at my watch. 59 minutes, Vanessa. I wouldn't waste them. The next hour was chaos. They scrambled. They argued. Vanessa tried to grab a painting off the wall, but the police officer stopped her. Daniel tried to talk to me, really talk to me this time, but I simply walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I could hear them through the house. The sounds of drawers slamming, the sound of Vanessa's heels, no longer sharp and confident, but frantic. When they were finally at the front door, their suitcases clutched in their hands like trophies of a failed war, Daniel turned back. He looked broken. For the first time, he looked like he realized exactly what he'd lost. "Mom, how could you do this? We're your family." "Family doesn't put family in a nursing home to buy a condo, Daniel. Family doesn't call their mother a burden 6 days after her husband's heart stopped." Vanessa stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You're still an old woman alone in a big empty house. You'll be begging us to come back in a month." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who thought she could break me with a whisper. "You told me to stop acting like a victim, Vanessa." I smiled. It was the first time I'd felt a real smile in a long time. "And look at where it's left you." I closed the door. I heard the sound of their car graveling down the driveway. I heard the silence return to the house. But it wasn't the stagnant, dusty silence of a week ago. It was a clean silence. I walked into the living room and sat in my chair. I looked at the fireplace, where the ashes of the brochure were long gone.
I was 71 years old. I was a widow. I was alone. But I wasn't a victim. And as I sat there, watching the sunlight fade across the hardwood floors, I realized that Harold was right. The fortress was still standing, and I was the queen of every single brick. A month had passed since the day the door closed on Daniel and Vanessa. The house was different now. I'd had the walls repainted, a soft, warm cream that caught the morning light. I'd hired a professional gardener to fix the fence and plant the roses Harold and I had always talked about. I still missed him, every single day, in the silence of the morning and the shadows of the evening. But the grief wasn't a heavy weight anymore. It was a companion. I spent my days reconnecting with the neighbors I'd ignored during the years I was focused only on Harold. I joined a book club. I started taking long walks in the park, watching the dogs and the kids, feeling the world move around me. Daniel had called a few times. He sounded small. He and Vanessa were living in a small apartment now, the Hamptons' dream gone, the condo plans evaporated. They were facing legal fees and the quiet judgment of their social circle. I didn't feel joy in their suffering, but I didn't feel the need to fix it either. One afternoon, I sat in the backyard, a cup of tea in my hand. The sun was warm on my face. I looked at the house, my house. I realized that for 40 years, I had been the wife. I had been the mother. I had lived my life in the shade of Harold's protection and Daniel's needs. But now I was just Evelyn. And Evelyn was someone I actually liked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was a photo of Harold and I on our wedding day. We were so young, so sure of the future. I whispered to the photo, "I handled it, Harold, just like you taught me." I felt a breeze rustle the leaves of the old oak tree. It felt like a pat on the shoulder. They say that silence is a sign of weakness. They say that being old means being finished. As I watched a bird build a nest in the eaves of my porch, I knew the truth. Silence is a strategy, and age is just the time it takes to build a fortress that no one can ever take away. I am Evelyn Miller. I am not a victim. I am the one who remains, and for the first time in my life, that is more than enough.